throughout, we have been mixing in personal reflection on ourselves and how we understand this in our relationships, but also counseling implications. So we'll continue to do that. The way the course is structured is that it's primarily to help you understand things for yourself, and then how do you apply them in counseling. But you'll see that we'll be interacting with both. So we looked at the first part of this instruction yesterday when we talked about the ways we communicate and the necessity of gracious communication and eliminating ungracious communication, so that a marriage will be resilient. But conflict is inevitable, and we're not always quick to listen and slow to speak, and we usually find ourselves using anger for a purpose. One of the things that's interesting is you'll find that there are people whose problem with anger is such that they really have a difficulty controlling it. But the vast majority of people, the reason they use anger is because it serves a purpose. It's not because it's just coming out. In psychological circles, there were theories of anger, and one theory of anger was kind of the volatility theory, which was kind of like things happen and they build up inside you, and then anger just comes out. And it can feel that way. But even in psychology, most people now realize that anger itself is a tool. It's a tool to get what I want. That's what James is talking about. Slow to speak and slow to become angry. But if I don't get my way, being quick to listen and slow to speak, I might use anger to get what I want. So you'll see that, and I've experienced that and observed it by watching people who are angry with their kids, then take a phone call from somebody and be very pleasant, right? They're expressing angry. Stop doing that! I can't believe you always do that. Oh, yeah, it's great to hear from you. You know, that's a tool. Now it's a habit, and anger can function in a habitual way. So it's not like anger just exists inside of us and then just comes out. Anger is a tool that we use, but sometimes we use it so frequently that it becomes a habit. And a lot of times people who use anger don't see that it's not so much it's the only thing they know how to do, but it's just such a strong pattern that they default to it every time. But the reality is we do get into conflict. The first thing I want to do, which is something that people don't often consider, is there is a difference between disagreement and conflict, particularly as it relates to marriage. It's very important to understand when you're in a disagreement and when you're in a conflict. The reason is because you can handle a disagreement without sin. You can even have a significant disagreement without sin. Conflict, by its biblical understanding and definition, involves sin, and we'll see why that is the case. So, what distinguishes disagreement from conflict? I'll give you an example. Back during 2020, in the United States, there were a number of things going on. There was this thing called COVID, if you ever heard that. And that affected us in some similar ways like you did, with the shutdown and the restrictions and masks everywhere. And in our culture, because in a sense our science was, along with some other countries, was being counted on to define the pandemic and recommend the resolutions to the pandemic. And so a lot of that was happening in our country, and there was great disagreement among people about whether they were doing the right thing or not. And so not simply the way they were handling controls, but actually how they were defining the illness and treating the illness. And so there was a lot of debate in our country. On top of that, it was an election year, and a very contentious election year. So and without going into too much detail, one of the ways COVID affected the election is it changed the way they let people vote. And they introduced different ways of voting, but they didn't do a great job of figuring out how to make it secure. I don't particularly think it affected the outcome of the election, but it did raise questions in the midst of an already difficult time. Was this a fair election? Was it an honest election? And certainly the president who lost the election made that the basis of everything he did, was trying to undermine the credibility of the election, which led to January 6th, the Capitol building under siege, and all that going on. So all that is playing out in the churches. What side are you on? Are you this side, this side? And the politics, are you for or are you against? And in the middle of that, there is a great deal of racial tension, because these issues all play out racially, and there were racial issues going on in the country. So for the United States, which is a stable country, it was a time of great upheaval. And so often in families, and certainly in churches, people had disagreements over things. And it's interesting because I know people on both sides of the arguments. And in one particular way, as related to some of these things, I found that my wife and I had different perspectives on things. We didn't see some of the issues the same way. Our life in general over 39 years is either we've generally viewed things in a similar way, because we've sat under the similar teaching and we've had similar life experiences, and so we've generally not had significant differences about what's going on in life. And also because she's a godly woman, and she is inclined to support me. She's inclined to let me exercise leadership in such a way as to frame out the issues for us. We'll discuss them. I've never had the feeling like I had to press her to agree on anything, because we generally agreed. But on this one, we just had disagreement. We just thought about it differently. And what I came to was the question of, okay, as the husband, should I call her to agree with me on this thing? Right? That was my question. Is it my responsibility to create agreement on these issues? We were not way far off, but we certainly were distinctive. And so even some of the people she trusted and listened to were different people than I would trust and listen to. Should I compel her to stop listening to these people, or should I force her to listen to people I'm going to listen to? I'm not going to say I handled it the right way, but what I came to was I felt like she was thinking about these issues responsibly. The people she was listening to, she wasn't trusting entirely. She was open to reason, open to dialogue. And I felt like because these issues, I really wasn't so confident. They weren't biblical issues. They weren't issues of the scriptures. They were issues of social concern. I had a different perspective as a pastor leading a church than she did as a mother interacting with family. And so I came to the conclusion that I felt like for me to try to get her to think about it my way would be to stray into her conscience and try to change her conscience. Part of that was because I know that she was praying, she was wrestling. She, like me, where we were similar is we were trying not to sort of believe that we understood everything. We both knew we didn't, but I felt like I can't compel her to agreement on a non-biblical issue. We may have to just disagree on this one. Now, again, there's nothing I'm saying that this applies to you in terms of how you should handle situations, but it's an illustration of a time where we had disagreement. But where God was kind to us is that it never elevated into a conflict. It went that way a few times, because when you're in those kind of conflicts and you're using different information, disagreements, and you're coming with different information, what can tend to happen is I just bring more information. You need to read this. You need to see this. Well, here's my information. And these days, certainly in the States, maybe here too, people are no longer dialoguing. They're just trying to convince each other with information, which is not dialogue. And so we resisted that temptation. We committed in the process to try to walk out James 1:19. Be quick to listen. I want to posture myself to listen to her, to hear her thoughts, to understand her reason. And I want to be slow to speak. I don't want to interrupt her. I don't want to challenge everything she's saying. And I don't want to get angry. I don't, even if I feel like she's not listening to me the way I'm trying to listen to her, I don't want to be angry. So God taught us, and it reminded us of times when we were parenting, where we had disagreement about the way we should handle an issue with one of the children. Now, in that situation, there was much more of a responsibility I felt I had to lead the family and say, I understand your perspective, but I think we need to do this. And we can talk about that when we talk about parenting. But the point is, if you don't have a category in your marriage for disagreement that can be resolved through dialogue, or at least come to clarity, then you will probably end up in a lot of conflicts you don't need to be in. That's the point of this. So disagreement is not necessarily conflict. Debate, being on two different sides of an issue and trying to help the person see why you think, and even trying to bring some convincing, or challenging their argument, is not necessarily arguing. I'm sure you guys have sat around dinner or a meal, sat around just together, and have you've had a class that day where all of you were heard something that really was new to you or challenging to you, and you sat around and you debated it. Well, how does it relate to this scripture? How does it do this? You can have significant debate. Certainly on a pastoral team, you need to be able to debate without arguing. You need to be able to, we have a large pastoral team, and all these men have opinions. We talk about complex topics. One of the things we're going to talk about when we talk about the issue of domestic abuse in this class is we had significant debate on how to do that. When you see, we're going to go through our marriage and divorce statement today, because I read it and I thought we do need to talk about it. That statement, I will point out where we had debate in that statement. So debate is not necessarily arguing. Every marriage will have disagreement. The issue is how we deal with it. When we come into marriage with ways to deal with disagreements that are hard to change, what the problem is, you come into your marriage with a way that you've learned to handle disagreement. And your wife has come into the marriage with her way of handling disagreement that she's learned from her upbringing, her family. So perhaps your way of dealing with disagreement is to press in. No, I want to talk more about this. I want to resolve this. I'm uncomfortable with this not being resolved. Maybe your spouse, your wife, comes from a family, from a history where they didn't deal with conflict. If something came up that had conflict, everybody just went silent, and they just divided, and they just never dealt with it. So you bring that into a marriage, and you want to talk about, let's say, a change in a change in laws that affect how you're going to, the decisions you have to make about housing, something like that. And you bring it up, and it's a difficult decision. There's no necessarily right and wrong answer. You have a different perspective. If you're the one who tended to say, no, we need to resolve this. We need to be on the same page. I can't handle lack of agreement. And you're trying to deal with somebody who doesn't like tension and avoids it. You end up with things like following somebody around the house trying to keep a conversation going. Or you end up with someone avoiding you, but eventually you end up with a conflict because you have two different ways of dealing with something. So the point there is just that you've got to recognize in your marriage, your way of dealing with conflict says more about your history than it does about your biblical application in most cases. Well, I think certainly anything revolving around our discipleship as believers, where the scriptures need to be brought in that defines what does being a disciple look like in this situation, would be something that, no, we need to resolve this. And if necessary, we need to get help to resolve this. Because we cannot compromise individually and together the commitment to follow Christ. So that's the most important thing. And then you have other things related to how we're going to build a family, how we're going to walk out our covenant, and how we're going to build our family. Today or tomorrow, we're going to talk about creating a family culture. How do we do that? So some of the things you will face in our culture with where there are disagreements among parents is, when does my child get a phone? And if they get a phone, how do we control what they do with it? That can create a lot of debate, because maybe the mother says, well, they need a phone because I need to be able to be in contact with them. Maybe the father says, but I know the danger of the phone, and I'm going to keep it away from them for as long as possible. That's what's our family culture? How are we going to do this? So in a marriage, you shouldn't have a lot of areas of disagreement. Number one, because you're building toward the same things. You're building together. Number two, you're both hopefully submitted to the scriptures and are seeking to know God's will for something. I think, and my guess, based on our conversations, in your experience, some of the greatest potential for disagreement is extended family and responsibility and obligation, and the way extended family has input into your life. In other words, you may have one that feels like, well, this my parents, they feel that they have access into our lives. The other says, no, I don't think parents should have access into our lives. So you have a disagreement, because you know what's going to happen if you have people with different family understandings. And maybe it's cultural, and maybe it's because there's one that's a good family and one that's a messed up family. And you realize, we love being with these people. This is nothing but a headache and a challenge. And this is all drama. This is all enjoyment. Well, I won't go too much into it. Within my children's families, they're all believers, right? All the kids that all my kids married Christians, and they come from Christian families. There are some families that are easy for them to relate to than others because of the expectations that are placed on them. And so even in our culture, which is generally not a generational culture, there are just expectations. So that might be one that would be a real issue for you in a marriage in Ethiopia. Does that make sense? Yeah, I think the issue that came up with us was, at what point am I, through leadership, stepping into a person's conscience that belongs to the Lord? This is where I come from. I don't think I can go into my wife's, her conscience, when we say conscience, not consciousness, but her convictional world, and make her do something that only the Holy Spirit can make her do, right? It's not an issue of obedience. She would, if I said, if she said, I think we need to do this, without going into the issues, she said, I believe that we should not be wearing masks, right? I don't think there's any science that supports us wearing masks. And she said, I'm not going to wear a mask. And from my perspective, I felt like, no, in my role, because I have to go into hospitals, I have to wear masks. And I want to show to people that I am deferential to their needs. Even if I'm not sure if masks work, even if I think it's a hassle, the principle I'm operating on is I want to serve other people. And I'd rather serve people who are fearful about masks than people who are against masks. I don't care really what people who are against masks think about me. I do care if I'm in an environment and someone feels vulnerable if you're not wearing a mask. So in that case, we came to agreement. I said, okay, you can have a difference on masks, but in this household, we're going to follow the guidelines that are set out for us, because the scriptures call us to honor, within reason, we know the reasons for that, honor the authorities over us. This is not an issue of whether you think masks are good or not, is not for me to tell you how to think. Whether to wear a mask or not is my responsibility. And so I said, that's where I'm going to exercise leadership. No, but in this home, in our family, in our marriage, we're going to handle it toward other people this way. We're going to be deferential. We're going to set an example of respect for the authorities and also love for other people. What did I do there? I didn't weigh into her conscience and tell her how to think. I just said, on the basis of these scriptures, here's how I'm leading us to respond. And she differed in her perspective, but she submitted. And she supported that. And she didn't tell other people, well, my husband's making me do that. She allowed my argument to be her argument relating to other people. Because she wanted unity, but she wanted unity through submission. That was her. She didn't want unity through agreement. She said, well, I'm willing to submit. I trust you with this decision. It's not an issue of conscience. It's an issue of what scriptures come into play for us to act out of. Is that helpful? You're asking a really good question, and I can't say in each situation how you should do it. What I'm trying to differentiate is between me telling her how to think and me calling to her a biblical response to whatever she thinks. So again, where you have to separate is when these are doctrinal issues and your wife's disagreement over doctrinal issues. Where there's great danger and damage in marriages is when a wife begins to adopt teaching from someone that you don't think is sound. She's listening to or reading something. That's a case where you might say, no, we cannot be different on these things. And I've seen men lead very well through that, and I've seen men not lead through that. It's one of the more difficult aspects of leadership at times, is when a woman feels like she's hearing something. If I draw an illustration, that is a relevant illustration. I don't want to do too much with it. But let's say your wife is under influence of people who say that no, there is no male leadership in a home. It should be equal, right? There should be, and so So you have a doctrinal conviction, know that this is a complementarian covenant. Your wife says, I would rather us be equal. First of all, if that's an issue before you're married, that needs to be resolved, because that will not go away with marriage. Second of all, it could be that your wife is influenced by people who think differently, and that's a case where you need to say, we must resolve this, and this is how I'm leading the family. And it can create a lot of tension in a home, because the wife is in that place where even though she feels she wants equality, you're calling her to submit to the Scriptures. And if she wants to make a different biblical argument, you can deal with that. I think what you've heard, you would hear. I think anyone who does significant biblical argument in these areas come down to a complementary position, that people who hold what's called egalitarianism, which is complete equality in the family and in the church. They actually have to stretch the Scriptures beyond their primary meanings to do that. Or they have to use other things that are not scriptural to make that happen. Well, it's not fair. That's not justice, which are not arguments that can be brought in biblically. So there are times where you're going to contend and even create momentary division in your home in order to stand for truth. A good husband is helped well by gracious, loving leadership when things are okay, and not trying to bring leadership only when things are not okay. When I experience this in talking to couples sometimes, the way it comes to me is, and we're going to get past this in a second, but the way it comes to me is a husband who has not been leading biblically and graciously, and then he finds his wife disagrees on something, and now he wants to change her. But his pattern has not been good leadership, and you don't respond to bad leadership with more bad leadership. So I think most of the time in pastorally, when I have a well-ordered home, you're not going to have disagreement, because God is at work bringing unity. When I deal with this pastorally, it's usually there's been a lack, either a domineering leadership that a woman begins to reject, or a passive lack of leadership that allows a woman to not come under her husband, to not even engage her husband on things she's thinking about, because he's distant. He's not involved. You know, that husband and father that we've talked a little bit about he works, he comes home, he sits at the television, everybody respects his privacy. That man, when it comes to leading his home in any culture, only has authority in his toolbox. All he has is my way, and anger to get that. There's a saying in counseling, when all your problems, when all you have is a hammer, all your problems look like nails, right? Meaning that if a man considers everything that in his home, if it's not complete obedience to him, then it's disobedience and disrespect. He's always going to be dealing with things with authority. And authority eventually stops working. When heavy authority continues in a society over time, revolution eventually happens. If authority is happening like that in a home, revolution eventually happens. If it's happening in a marriage, revolution eventually happens. He loses authority by over-exercising authority. So that's a deviation, but it gets to this point. We need to have another thing we need to have, and this is very important. This will help you guys. Have a good distinction between temptation and sin in your marriage. So you're having a conversation, and there's a little bit of heat in the conversation. That doesn't necessarily mean anybody's sinning. Just because it's not pleasant doesn't mean there's sin. It does probably mean that you're both being tempted. And so the Scriptures have a clear delineation with temptation and sin. With temptation, we can resist sin. we don't have to confess temptation as sin. Temptation is its own biblical category of you will be tempted in many ways. Jesus was tempted in many ways but did not sin. We can follow that example. Temptation doesn't automatically lead to sin. Temptation can actually remind me that my flesh wants to wage war and I'm going to resist it. So it's wonderful sometimes when you get to the end of a difficult conversation with your wife to be able to both say, we were both really tempted, but neither one of us transgressed. In order to have this understanding that's helpful, we have to have some different ways of seeing what sin is. We know that sin is transgression against God's law. It's transgressive. It's also motivational. Now, there's a guilt of sin that has been handled by Christ, and we no longer have that. The power of sin's been broken in redemption. The remaining sin, we still have sinful propensities and habits and desires. We have that. But there's also this category of transgression where I am tempted, but I did not transgress. It's the man who is on his phone and sees images that are tempting to him, and he actually starts to go that way, and then he turns off his phone. That man did not sin. That man successfully resisted temptation. If I'm in conversation with my wife over a difficult topic, and I'm struggling, and I feel like I need to, I'm not being represented well, I don't feel like she's understanding my point, but I do, James, be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. We can get through the whole conversation and even a disagreement, and nobody's ever sinned. But it may feel like sin. You may feel like you're being sinned against because you're not being heard the way you want to be heard. You can resist that temptation to react. What happens in most marriages is someone feels like they're not being heard, or someone feels like the way the person's talking to them is disrespectful, and they react sinfully. They act against James 1:19. And by doing that, they've now transgressed, which has created a sin that they now need to own. So the main thing is there's a great joy in a marriage when you realize we have conversation over difficult things, but we did not transgress. We were tempted, but we did not transgress, and we can celebrate that. And then God uses disagreement for good purposes. God wants to reveal our thinking through disagreement. He wants to reveal fallacies in our thinking through disagreement. He wants to reveal prejudices in our disagreement. He wants to reveal pride in our self-perspective in disagreement. What we love is that person who's closest to us, who knows us best, is able to speak to us in a way where we gain insight, not just make decisions. Wisdom is gaining insight for the purpose of real life living. So that's disagreement is not conflict. So what turns disagreement into conflict? James has helped us there as well. I'm sure you guys have discussed this. James 4:1-3. What causes quarrels and fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and do not have. You murder, you covet, and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and you do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy with God. There is a ton in there that we could unpack simply about what does it mean by being an adulterous people. What does it mean? How does this conflict mean I'm a friend of the world? There are a lot of good things to talk about. We're not going to go into it heavily because I want to isolate this dynamic based on the question, what causes quarrels and fights among you? You're in disagreement. What turns it into a conflict? And so there's some insights from this text on that basis. Conflict is rarely about the issues we disagree on. Problems are generally not in the realm of lack of knowledge or even of our opinions. You can have different opinions and have not conflict. You can have different ideas of knowledge and have not conflict. It's so interesting to me in a marriage counseling context to watch people have an interaction and realize they're in the middle of a conflict and they think the answer is, well, you obviously don't have enough information. And they just keep saying, well, this is what I think. And they're debating, and they keep debating as if angry debate will convince somebody that you're right. That's the way social media functions. I was on social media last night, and I happened to see an interaction that some people were having over a political issue. And I just went through it. I only know the person who was my friend who was having this interaction with the other people. And my friend wasn't doing a good job. But I noticed that nobody actually engaged anybody's perspective. They just reacted and through their perspective. And then that person would react, and then they would say, well, what about this? And you could tell they weren't even engaging the other person's point. They were just simply saying, what you need is more information. You obviously have been influenced by the wrong people. You obviously don't know what's going on in the deep state. You obviously don't know the corruption. You obviously this. And so what you need is more information. Read this, do this, do this, this. As if that's going to solve a conflict. The Bible doesn't root conflict in a lack of information. Conflict is a result of our entrenched desires, what we want, being elevated to demands. And so what happens is that's exactly what happens. There is a progress that takes place. There's something I want, I don't get it, so what I do, now it's not just simply a want, now I must have it, and you must give it to me. And if you don't give it to me, now I need to go to war and get it. It wasn't like it was ever needful for me to go to war. It's only because what I want, I'm not getting. That's the point James is making. All conflicts have that pattern. A want in our hearts that becomes a demand of others or of God, and he points that out. You want, but you ask for wrong motives. You ask for this. You even go to God and say, God, give me this, but because you ask the wrong motives, you don't get it. God isn't going to bless your wrong motives. He's got bigger purposes than you getting what you want. You make your demands of God. God does not submit to your demands. People don't submit to our demands. Then what they want becomes a demand. And what happens in a conflict is two people with demands insist on getting their demands met. And we have conflict. That is war making. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about why we make war. This idea that I have, it's interesting, the way it actually works is in our sinful thinking is it starts with what we think we need. I have a need, which even there realizes that there's something that in Christ that I'm not getting what I want, because he really is sufficient for our needs. So even to say I have a need that's not being met, I have a need for you to love me. I have a need for you to respect. Let's use marriage and watch this play out. Often in marriage, what a man feels like he needs from his wife is respect. And he can point to the Bible. Wives, respect your husbands. Men love that text. They love that command because that meets a need that they have to be respected. So I need to be respected. I don't feel like my wife is respecting me. I need to let her know I want you to respect me. I've elevated my sense of need to, it actually works the other way too. I want respect. I'm not getting it. Now I need it. I need it. Right now, I need your respect. In this situation, I'm not getting your respect. So now I must demand it. And you're not giving it to me. Now I must go to war and get it from you. The wife, typical marriage. I want to be loved. That's my thing. I want to be the most important person in your life. I'm not feeling in this situation I'm the most important person in your life. So I need to be the most important to in your life. I can't live without that. You're depriving me of something that's necessary for me. Disregarding whether that's the scriptures or not, that's the way I'm living. Oh, you are not expressing that I'm the most important person in your life. Now I must demand it. You are the husband. You must love me as Christ loved the church. I don't see you doing that. Where are you loving me like Jesus says you're supposed to love me? You're not doing that. I don't need to respect you because you're not doing that. They'll take the scriptures. We both take the scriptures and use them against one another. So now I'm going to do things that wage war on you. I'm going to deprive you of respect. I'm going to deprive you of my attentiveness to you. And so many conflicts in marriage are happening over Ephesians 5. Well, he's not loving me. She's not respecting me. If she would respect me, then I would love her. Well, if he would love me, then I would respect her. What are they doing? They're arguing because they've made these commands of God for themselves demands on the other person. And now they're in conflict. So that's the way it tends to play out. What irritates about our spouse is the way they get in the way of what we want or feel like we need. That's when we know it's sin or it's a temptation. When we want something and we're not getting it, we make more effort to get what we want than to ask the question, why do I want this so much? Why do I need this from you? The reason is because we have idols. You guys are familiar with talking about sin in terms of idolatry, right? Okay, good. So I don't have to go into that. But this is where idolatry works. This is where it functions. We have idols. We have ruling desires, as scriptures call them. So what I found in marriages, here are typical ruling desires. There is a desire for comfort or pleasure. That it comes out in the fact that someone prefers ease. They prefer a sense of peace and or lack of responsibility for things. They love leisure. You know, my ideal day is a day where basically I don't have to really make any effort to do anything I don't want to do. That's a comfort idol. These aren't all, but these are common. There are also control idols or independence. Many people have control idols, and control idols function a couple different ways. One, it can be, I need to control you. I need to control my environment. Another way is, my environment and other people cannot control me. Someone who functions independently has a control idol. But the way they express it is not, I need to control you. It's, no, but you're not going to control me. You want me to do this? I'm not going to do it. I express my independence. And you'll see that person's ideal day is when everything goes the way they want. That's their ideal. Thank you. A third one is the esteem of others, what we often call the fear of man. That's an idol. What other people think about me is very important. It also functions in, do I feel understood? You know, if I don't feel understood, then I don't feel valued as a person. I need to be understood. I need to be appreciated. I need that for other people to view me in the way I want them to view me. And so the desire, and so what you'll see there in a person's typical, a great day for them is everybody is happy with them and thinks they're great, and they don't feel misunderstood. They speak and everybody says, you're wise, you're great. This environment is a great environment for my fear of man, because it makes me want to do and say things that make you think I'm a great guy, right? I want to leave this environment with you thinking, wow, all the way from America, God sent the prophet. That's the way, in my flesh, I want to be understood. I don't want to let you into the parts of me that are not that pleasant. I don't want you to see that part of me, because I know if I can get out of here tomorrow night with you only having good experiences with me, then that'll be what you think about me all the time. You'll see it in the way people do social media, how they present themselves on social media. That's the esteem of others, the fear of man. Another idol that's very common is an idol of rights. If I feel wronged, somebody needs to pay. Somebody needs to make this right. They're very high on justice. This is unjust. And my rights are violated. That person, their ideal day is that everything happens in the way they think it should happen. And nothing happens to them that they think is wrong. They're very moralistic. Everything's a moral issue. And they either need to... I'll talk about our lives in just a second. But so it's very important to that self-righteous person that somebody is... that they're vindicated, whatever happens. They're made right. They're always right. And you're always wrong. And then the last one is possessions. People who idolize possessions. What I have. I compare myself with others. I never have enough. I need this and this and this and this to make me happy. And if I can't get this, I'm unhappy. That person, their typical good day is they sit and they enjoy their things. I love my phone. I love my music. I love my podcast. I love everything. I accumulate things. What happens is, in a marriage, we don't come with the same idols. We come with different idols. My idol is a comfort idol. My primary one that I'm going to function in is comfort. If I can make it easy, I'm going to try to make it easy. I've struggled with laziness all my life. And I can revert to laziness. And I just love it's just not my problem. It's just not my problem, right? I don't have to deal with it? Okay, I'm not going to deal with it. I can put it off till tomorrow. Something comes in to me on my email this week when I'm in. This is part of the reason this is a great experience for me, if I'm honest, is because it teases out my comfort idols. Because guess what? While I'm here, I can't do anything about problems there. I'm irrelevant there, and I love that. I love being here and seeing an email come and saying, sorry, can't help you. I'm here having great food and great times with people for Jesus' sake, right? and so this is a wonderful environment for me, because if I have an esteem idol, it really works for me, because I can perform, at least for a week, I can perform for you. You get me 2 weeks, you might start to see the wheels come off. But for a week, I can probably... But my guess is this. You guys are now discerning. You've had 2 weeks with me. You see some of the cracks in me already. So I'm losing my ability to be confident that I can convince you of how great I am. But, so I have that. And so it's a wonderful experience. My wife has control idolatries, right? Actually, we both have control idolatries. But the way her control works is she wants to be overseeing everything. She wants to manage everything. She's not comfortable with things not being in order. If you're in our house, you'll see. We have several cabinets that are full of things like medicines or whatever that you just accumulate over time. She has an ability to stack things and go into a cabinet and pick something out and put it back in. I open up the cabinet, it just all falls out on me. And then I just throw it in there, And why do I not put it away? Number one, because I know she will. She can't stand it being that way. So if she sees it, she's going to take the time and do it. And number two, she'll never be happy with how I do it, right? I'll make a point of stacking it. I grew up, my mom taught me not to have an unmade bed. And so I've just always had a mate. So when everybody in college in my dorm, I couldn't do it. I had to make my bed. Here, I'm making my bed every day, which is actually a challenge with a net. I mean, it really is a challenge to work around the net. But when I make our bed at home, she just walks in and goes, because she knows how to make it. And I haven't done it quite the way she wants it done. So it's always a little bit of a temptation. But it would be a bigger temptation if I left the bed unmade. So I can't do it right? I make the bed, it's not quite what it is. It's funny for us because we have all these kind of things. She controls, but I need control. I control by independence. Just don't control me because I need comfort. And you are imposing on me with your agenda. So in some sense, in the way our life works well is if I just let her control things and I just chill. In our natural human state, if we weren't followers of Christ, what you would see in our marriage is her running everything and me just benefiting from that. Now, we would still have conflict because my comfort idols are going to sometimes clash with your control idols. You're going to want us to do this, and I'm going to say, no, I don't want to do this, and you're going to have control issues, and I'm going to have comfort issues. So it's not like getting your way eliminates conflict. But in your marriage, you will have that. It's a great conversation to have in your marriage. You probably already know, and because this is where your conflicts are. But those are kind of things. So we don't really have that much of a problem with what other people think of us. Generally, we don't live with that. And we don't really live with possessions. We don't care, really. We give things away. We don't, we'll keep things forever until they wear out. We don't have to have everything new and nice or anything like that. We've always driven old cars. We like old cars. Where our issues are I have comfort desires and I have independence desires. And she has control desires and she has rights desires. So when we get into a situation, she hates being wrong. I'm okay with being wrong. Like if, hey, and our conflicts will look kind of funny because it will look like we'll get into a conflict and we're arguing this way. There's something about this and I'll start to realize I'm losing the argument, that I really, she's probably more right than I am. And I'll say, okay, no problem. And I'll just walk away. And that's frustrating for her because she needs it resolved. Her control idol needs it resolved. And she needs to know who's to blame. She'll confess to she'll confess to starting COVID. Like if it'll just determine that there's somebody to blame. She'd rather be to blame than have nobody to blame. So I'm saying, no, you didn't do anything wrong. But she'll confess to people. I'm saying, you don't need to confess that. You didn't do anything wrong. But she so doesn't want it left without justice. And so, and if she feels right and I'm not owning it, that bothers her. If I just say, no, I just think we have a disagreement. If I really want to frustrate my wife in a conflict, I'll be in the middle of a debate and to the point where we feel like we're in conflict, and I'll just say, well, whatever, we'll just disagree. That's hard for her. Because, no, we can't get into this without resolving it because of my control and without getting somebody to blame. And she'll sometimes say, why don't you just say, I'm wrong? Just say, I'm wrong. If you just said, I'm wrong, I'd be okay. And I'd say, because I don't think I'm wrong. I just am tired of arguing. But no, you need to. And so then my comfort idol is I'm trying to get out of the argument because I'm tired and I want to get into something else. Marriage conflict works like that. Your idols are at work. God's purpose for conflict is redemptive. He lets us get into this. God lets it. God could prevent it. We could be in the middle. We could be, our worst conflicts have started about 11 o'clock at night. Because one of the things where we're different in our marriage is bedtime. For me, the way I get to a place of sleep is I just turn everything off in my brain. I just flip switches. Church, turn it off. This, turn it off. Whatever's going on, turn it off, turn it off, turn it off, turn it off, turn it off. Sleep. My wife needs to download. She needs to take everything she's been feeling and doing all that day, and she needs to put it somewhere. And so it'll be, and we don't usually go to bed before 11:30. So we'll come up, and when I get there, I'm committed to my process of going to sleep by means either just distracting myself by reading something or just mentally shutting everything down. She comes in and she says, so today this happened. And I'm like, no, I've already turned off that switch. I'm not turning it back on for you. And so I'll do various things to communicate that I don't want to talk that are not verbal, right? I don't say, honey, you know what? I'm really tired. Can we talk about that tomorrow? I don't say that. Usually I just turn around and face the other direction. That's not a blessing for her, right? That doesn't appeal to her. That communicates something to her. I think it communicates, I don't want to get into this conversation. To her, it communicates, you don't love me. And then it's 2:30 in the morning, and we're talking about the same thing over and over again. Fortunately, this doesn't happen. I think this hadn't happened in about 2 or 3 years, but earlier in our marriage, our conflicts would go into the night because we're so tired and so dumb, because we're tired, that we're not even making sense. I don't know what I was saying, but what I mean is this. I don't know what I can't even understand what you're saying right now. What you're not even making sense. Let me say it one more time, and let me say it louder so you'll make sure you hear it. I think the problem is you're not hearing it, so I'm going to say it louder. Look at me. I'm talking to you. Not very pleasant. But that's what happens. God has a purpose. God could prevent it. God could, at that moment when we're getting ready to have that conflict because I've turned away and she feels like I've rejected her, He could have all the power go off. And we'd not be focused on that anymore. Okay, let's just go to bed because it's dark. We could do that, but we don't because God says, no, I'm going to let you have a conflict to see what I want you to see. Now, here's some tactics, and these are said in somewhat of a Western way, but the reason I bring them up is because in our lives, we have certain tactics. Just like in war, you have certain tactics you use to fight your battles, and different people have different tactics. So I'm going to read through them, and I'm going to let you guys tell me for yourself which of these tactics are tactics you will use. Particularly in your closest relationships, your marriage, fiance, girlfriend, the ones that you're most vulnerable in. So here's, say 3 of these. If you had to pick 3 of these, okay, one tactic is I interrupt people. You're in the middle of talking, I'm just going to interrupt you. What am I doing? I'm stopping your control, I'm starting my control every time I interrupt. The other thing I do is I bring up past failures in present situations. So we're having a conflict. an argument. And what I'll do is say, well, you know what? This is a pattern. I've seen you do this. You did this back in 1979. You did it in like 1999, and you've done it again. See, that's a pattern. You've never even resolved that you've done it. This validates my concern because you've done it multiple times over 40 years. We bring up the past. We use emotions to get our way. For men, sometimes it comes across as we present kind of like an alpha male anger. We're not being angry, but we raise our voice. We're stern. We say things hard. For women, and it can be emotion. There can be tears. Now, guys can cry and women can alpha if they want to, but generally speaking, in marriages, they break around somewhere. Someone gets emotional. Someone they get aggressive. That's using emotions to get our ways. Do I exaggerate or universal language? That's what I mean by that is, do you say things, well, you know what, you always do this. You never do this. You know what, you never. That's what we call universal language. Taking something that someone has done or is doing and they're saying, well, this is what you always do. Or, you've never done this for me. You've never done this for me. Or, you know what you always do? That's universal language. Do I label? Do I put a label on you? One of the favorite ones in our country is you're just like your mother or you're just like your father. We've used that. It doesn't work. In fact, we've used it now. We've so talked about it, and because it's interesting because the real characters in our families were my father and her mother, right? We love them both. Her mother just passed away 8 months ago. And she was wonderful, but God rest her soul. Truth was not an important thing for her. The story was more important than the truth, right? So with her, it was always about telling the story. But you'd realize, I don't know if I trust anything she's saying. And she would talk a lot, right? She loved to tell stories. My dad was similar. But my dad's approach was, he would tell stories and you would think about it, and okay, I've heard this story and this story and this story, and they don't line up. He couldn't have been in all those places at the same time. And I realized over time that my dad, because he had this desire to be approved by people, whatever you were talking about, he would make up a story. Or at least take something that maybe happened to somebody around him and put himself in the center of it and make it his story. And so we have these tendencies. My dad did other things too. My dad was a guy where, like, if you were trying to leave, like to go somewhere, he made like 8 trips in and out to get things. Oh, I forgot this. Oh, I got to get this. I got to get this. You'd be sitting in the car. I grew up this way. You know, you're sitting there, you're trying to get somewhere, and he's going in, he's got to get this, get this. So we had characteristics. And so what we've learned to do is just very gently say, oh, honey, that might be Lois right there. You know, with my wife. If she's telling a story, because she's a great storyteller, that might be Lois. That may be more detail than people are looking for right now. But they're looking, they asked you a question, they're looking for an 8-sentence answer. You gave them a 5-minute story. They probably don't need that. Or my dad, you know what? You're talking as if you have a better story than everyone else. That was a tendency. But we do that. You're like your mother. And it could be, those are ways that are very affectionate toward our parents. You may have had awful experience with a parent, and to be reminded that you're acting like that could be very hurtful and offensive. So, do I hit below the belt by using someone's vulnerability against them? The word hit below the belt comes from boxing, where it's illegal to hit below someone's belt in boxing, obviously. And so what it means is you in marriage, you have vulnerabilities. Someone knows you in your worst. Somebody knows things about you that nobody else knows. Somebody has gotten beyond the curtain of your life and sees you for who you are. If they we can begin to bring that into our conflicts and use that against somebody. You have a fear of something that and then somebody starts using that against you. That's something we can do. We psychoanalyze. By that I mean that we tell people what their motivations are. Well, the reason you're saying that is because you're this. Because you're being narcissistic. You're being controlling. You take somebody and their behavior and you turn it into what they are. You tend to look for blame in others to justify myself. So it's so in a conflict, and both Jill and I can do this. We're talking about an issue, and we're in a conflict over the issue, and I might realize that I'm 80% of the problem. What am I going to do? I'm going to try to get the 20% of the problem as the center of the argument. I want to blame her, because by blaming her, I get out of the heat. So we can tend to look to blame to justify myself, and it will look like this. Well, I know I did that. Yeah, you're right. I did sin that way. I did do that. You're right. But you. Let's not look at this just like it's just me. I'm acknowledging that I've got sin, but you, my goal is, it's not really a confession, as we'll see. It's just my attempt to turn attention off of me and get it onto her. So, do I tend to be defensive or deflect responsibility? Do I just say no? I just get defensive. I start arguing for the sake of arguing. Do I argue just to get my way? Do I try to use, this is a danger for pastors who, like I mentioned yesterday, because of our access to the Word of God, we can begin to use the Word of God to fill our selfish anger and fill our arguments, even though it's not what God would intend. Do I minimize my sin in light of the other person's sin? Yes, I did. I do that. Do I tend to look to prosecute arguments? Do I take our argument and put it in the courtroom, and now I'm the prosecutor and judge, and I'm bringing accusations, and I'm here's my evidence. Here's my evidence for my conclusion, and I'm judging you on the basis of this. And how do you plead? Are you guilty or are you not? Many arguments are courtroom arguments in a marriage. Do I withdraw when things are uncomfortable? Do I tend to withdraw? My understanding of this, in a broad sense, American culture is, when it comes to conflict, is an attack culture. If there's conflict, I'm going to move toward it. Because I want to win. I want to be right. Other cultures, perhaps your culture, is an avoidance cultures. When I get into a situation where there's tension, I will pull away. Maybe even to the point where I just disengage with you as if it never happened. And so in American culture, you have people who are in conflict with people constantly and have multiple people that are on their enemies list at any particular time. In other cultures, there can be, there's nobody close to me because I'm currently disconnected from everybody and until the heat blows over, and then I can re-engage and we can continue as if nothing happened. That's a common, in some cultures, that's the way conflicts are handled. It's conflict avoidance. Americans in general are competitive, and they don't tend to avoid conflict. They tend to try to win conflict. So, and there may be others. So I'm going to go around the room. Some of these may be familiar to you. Some of them may be more Western than others. But are they, let's say, one or two that you think, yeah, if you were watching me in a conflict, you would tend to see this taking place. This is my tactic. So who wants to start? Yeah, what we talked about yesterday, being right in information does not matter to God. Me being right is irrelevant to God because if I'm not righteous, God looks on the heart. And so God is after the heart. So you can be right in your information or your analysis, but God will oppose you. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because you raise an excellent insight. We use the labeling to create distance, right? Because when I label you, I'm no longer part of the conflict. I'm an evaluator. Now I'm outside of it. I'm up above it, right? I set myself above it so that I can disregard it. Well, obviously, only God can teach you this, so I'll just wait on God to do that. And I absolve myself of my responsibility by becoming by taking a formal role of being a labeler. So that's very good. Yeah. And we can use body language too, right? Like one of the things, I had a chair in our room at home that was kind of like my chair I read in and those kind of things. And if we were in our room and we were engaged in a conflict, I would go sit in the chair. And so Jill would be walking around talking, and I'd sit in the chair, and gradually everything I was doing was defensive, right? And she says, "You're hiding in your chair." Because everything I was communicating with my body was, I couldn't leave the room. I knew that was stupid. And so I had to stay in the room, so I just tried to disappear into my chair. And I adopted a defensive posture. I was kind of like you guys have turtles here? Yeah. Okay. I was like a turtle. I'm getting inside the shell. I can't leave. I'm not fast enough to run away, so I'm just getting in my shell. And now you've got to attack me. I was forcing her to try to attack me. And then what would happen? If she attacked me, then I could rise out of the chair and fight back. So I was baiting her into my trap, and then I was going to attack. So that wasn't necessarily thinking that way, but that's how it would play out. But there's an important aspect of this, and again, because the gospel, the scriptures are not bound by culture, they address every culture in its weaknesses. And so, in order to understand conflict, we have to understand conflict as broken shalom, right? Shalom, the way God wants things to be. Conflict is when my interaction with you has broken the shalom in our relationship, which means whether I fight you or I run away, I'm still in conflict because shalom is broken. So in a culture where conflict avoidance is the tendency, that is not a lack of conflict. And so in your church, where people have had that as a natural tendency, cultural tendency, in various ways, in order to help them live as disciples of Christ in a culture which is not their new received culture. We have a kingdom culture. The Sermon on the Mount, that's what Jesus is doing. He's saying, I know how you live. I know how you think things should work. I know what you think God blesses. Let me tell you where you're wrong. And my kingdom works like this. This is my kingdom principle. We don't avoid and achieve shalom. We must deal with conflict to return to shalom. That's going to be our next lesson on how do we resolve conflict. But the important thing is the absence of argument is not the absence of conflict. It is just a way to handle my conflict in a preference that I have. The reason this is important for marriages is because we do this habitually. And so our conflicts in marriages tend to pattern. They tend to go, over time, they tend to go along the same ways. We end up in the same kind of conflicts, saying the same kind of things over and over again because we're convinced that this works. But it never works because this is the flesh. All these things are the flesh, and God opposes the flesh, and God is after us dying to flesh and living for Christ, which is what we're going to talk about as we move toward this. But let's start with, and I'm just going to walk through these things because we need the gospel. There's nothing in us that will make us do anything but engage in conflict. So how does the gospel speak to this? And you'll have this in the materials when it gets to you. Through the gospel, I've been reconciled to God and live as a minister of reconciliation to others. Therefore, I can approach all my conflicts looking for God's reconciliation purposes for me in them. God sends me into the conflicts, even the conflicts that I'm creating, with a goal of reconciliation. I have to commit to be reconciled in order for me to live in the good of the gospel. Second one, through the gospel, I have forsaken my own righteousness for the righteousness of Christ. Therefore, I can see disagreement or even the sins of others against me as an opportunity to die to myself and glorify God. What you think about me, what you say about me is not really that important. I am worse than you think. I don't have my righteousness in myself. My righteousness is in Christ. Through the gospel, I find my identity in my union with Christ. Therefore, I'm able to please God no matter what another person does to me. In conflict, the actions of another person never need to define me or determine how I act. What you do to me does not compel me to respond in any way. You have no control on me. That's a powerful thing. It's a powerful thing to realize whatever you do, you have no control over me. I have a God who is calling me to live out the way I should, and I need to be faithful to that. Through the gospel, I've been forgiven of the guilt for my sin. I can confess sins I commit, knowing that God will forgive me of them. Since God forgives me of my sin, I can confess it to others with honesty, clarity, and conviction. It's because I'm forgiven by God that allows me then to confess my sin to others. In fact, compels me to. With 1 John 1. Through the gospel, I see that forgiveness comes with the price heavily paid by the one who extends it. Therefore, in conflict, I will never trivialize asking forgiveness and will never offer forgiveness without the intent to fully release the person I am forgiving from the debt he or she owes from me. The next session, we're going to be talking about forgiveness. One of the things I'm very concerned about in churches is the way that even pastors tend to resolve issues with people is a massive misunderstanding of confession and forgiveness and repentance. And so we don't teach it well and we don't apply it well. Through the gospel, I know that God is at work in my circumstances by His Spirit to make me more like Christ. Therefore, I can view conflicts as opportunities to grow through adversity, not unpleasant interruptions in my life. When I'm in a conflict, I'm in there with God. I may be resisting. I may be actually in opposition to what He wants me to do, but He will not abandon me in my conflict. He is patient. He will be with me. So when I turn to Him, He will respond. He will not reject me. Many Christians, they go from conflict to condemnation. There's no need for condemnation even when we've sinned in conflict, because God has not abandoned us into our conflict. He follows us in, seeks to draw us back to Him. And the last one, through the gospel, I've been called to a life of faith, hope, and love. Therefore, I can view conflict resolution as an opportunity to walk out a life of a peacemaker who sows in peace to raise a harvest of righteousness. We're going to talk about this in the next session. But seeing myself as a peacemaker, as a major function in my life in every relationship, whether I'm helping other people or I'm dealing with my own problems, is a powerful identity to walk in a conflict. If you're in your marriage, one of the things I try to help husbands see is if you're in a marriage conflict, part of your leadership responsibility is to guide the conflict out. At the end of the day, as a husband, I can't sort of hope that something happens. I have the responsibility to say, we are not where God... Shalom has been broken in our marriage at the moment. My responsibility is to do whatever it takes to get there. That doesn't mean I have to own all the responsibility for the conflict. It might mean I need to say, but I cannot leave it unaddressed. I cannot leave us in a state of ongoing conflict. If I do that, I fail my love for my wife because I leave her vulnerable to the enemy. I leave her vulnerable in her sin. I don't give her the grace. I don't offer her the grace of forgiveness. I don't offer the grace of my humility in confession. And I don't lead us into reconciliation that makes us stronger. And I don't help us to grow and change. So we don't have the option as husbands to leave conflict on the table unresolved. And there are times in my life where I've said, multiple times in my life where I said to my wife, Jill, I'm angry right now. I feel misunderstood. I feel like you're judging me. I know I'm not right, but I really feel like that you are. And this is my flesh talking, but I'm also trying to apply God's word in the middle of that. But I know, no matter how I feel I'm being treated, I have to bring us to a place of reconciliation. I need to start with confession. I need to own my own sin. And so I'm going to do that right now. And I don't always do it well, and sometimes I'll do it, and then she'll say something, and I'll be tempted again. But I need to start, and I need to make sure we begin to move toward reconciliation. Brothers, we cannot leave that to our wives to do. We cannot put the burden on our wives to solve the relational problem. We own it. God calls us to it. It's the way we love. If we do that, then ultimately our wife will respect that because she'll know that even though I'm actively sinning in my flesh, I'm trying to obey God in my role. And she will respect and she'll begin to help me do that. Not because she thinks I'm right, but because she recognizes I have a responsibility to carry out for us, and she wants to cooperate with that. So that's a very important. But these are gospel principles that are designed to strip away any sense that I have that I'm a victim in conflict. If we're in conflicts, we're never victims. Everything we need in the gospel allows us to respond, even if we sin, in a way that can please God. So any questions before we take a break? That's very good. Let me speak to that because I can speak that a bit both in our relationships and in counseling. Yes, sometimes you realize we're just being foolish and what we're doing is not helping. It may be wise in your function as the leader in the home to say, I don't think what we're doing right now is really honoring God. Let's do this. Let's don't let the sun go down on our anger. Let's acknowledge to God that we're both angry. And let's just ask God. Let's not confess to one another, but let's confess to God that we know we're not responding well to Him. And then let's ask God, let's take some time and let's ask God to help us get insight into our contribution. And let's get back together. Let's say you have a conflict at night, right? And you have to go to work the next morning, and so you're not going to be able to deal with it then. So tomorrow night, we're going to sit down and we're going to go back and review this, and we're going to talk about it. But in the meantime, we're going to pray. We're going to ask God for help. We're going to ask God for humility. Because I think that's going to be more helpful and effective in resolving this than just continuing to argue. So yes, I think you can. Sometimes in marriage counseling, when I see that people just get into it and they can't get out of it, I say what you need is a room in your apartment or your house that is your quiet room. And either one of you can at any point in time decide that you're going to go in that room because you feel like you're not helping the argument, or the other person's making it difficult. We have an agreement that if one of you goes in that room, the other person cannot follow them. The other person cannot bang on the door or say, open the door. We respect the fact that the person, rather than making a decision to attack, has made a decision to withdraw for the purpose of getting self-control. We lack self-control. I'm going to go in here to get self-control. And what I'll do in counseling is when there's constant argument in a marriage, I'll say, we're going to try that. When someone does that, now if there's kids running around, it complicates things, but when someone does that, then both of you have a quiet space, right? There's a door between you. And that door can function as a place for you, your sanctuary, where you can both get a break from what you feel is attack from others, but also engage the Lord. And what I expect to happen is when you come out, and both of you have been trying to engage God. Now you might have to go back in, or the other person might need to go back in. But the important thing is, what am I doing? I'm introducing into this that nobody is going to be controlled by the other person in an argument. And I'm introducing that you value self-control more than you value getting your point across. And so it's a way to get self-control. And then I'll give him a time, and then I'll say, okay, how did it go? Well, I did that, and he came and kept knocking on the door saying, you need to come back out. I'll address the husband. We agreed that we wouldn't do that. Why did you do that? Because we didn't want to finish the argument. Well, didn't we agree? Why did you? And I start to get an idea of where the real sin issues are in that man's heart by giving them something to do like that. I also break patterns when I do that. So that's one way in counseling you can help a couple when they're in conflicts that they can't get out of. Well, let's do this. It introduces, because the other thing it introduces respect for that person and their decisions. You may not want them to go in there, but you have to respect that they did that. When we're in conflict, we lose respect for one another temporarily. So yes, you can do that. The danger is when people talk about don't let the sun go down in your anger. There's debate in pastoral theology about what that means. Nobody that I know would say it means that you have to resolve every conflict. It simply says you cannot nurse and fester anger without resolving it. Whatever you're doing with the conflict, the issue, you cannot nurse your anger multiple days. You must deal with your anger before the Lord in order to resolve the conflict. So the issue isn't don't let the sun go down on your conflict. It's don't let the sun go down on your anger. Don't keep anger stirred in your heart day after day after day. And because he also talks about bitterness, because when you do that, you end up in bitterness. Bitterness is simply anger retained in the heart over the course of time.